All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 26, Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, 1932 to 1941. We'll be looking at section number 1, the rise of Franklin Roosevelt. So let's just recall in Chapter 25, we talked about the stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression. This was the worst economic period in American history, and it was President Herbert Hoover, who was president at the time, who for the most part received most of the blame for the Depression era. Franklin Roosevelt runs for the presidential election of 1932, and it's Franklin Roosevelt, also called FDR for short, I'll probably just be using FDR here, versus Herbert Hoover. And in that election, even though Franklin Roosevelt was, really kind of promising something new, the dislike of Hoover was so strong that Roosevelt won this election by more or less a landslide. And so Roosevelt became the president-elect in 1932, promising to do something about the economic depression. Now, Roosevelt himself, he had served in a number of capacities, including the governor of New York, so he had the political experience that was necessary. And he surrounded himself with a group of people that became known as the Brains Trust. This was a group of advisors to Franklin Roosevelt. They had helped him in New York. He had succeeded in passing kind of some new and innovative laws to tackle some of the problems there locally, and he brought these advisors with him to the White House. Roosevelt himself was also known for battling polio, that he had lost the use of his legs because of polio, and this really made him be perceived by the American public as a fighter. This is a guy who, even though that he was born in a very affluent family, he was Ivy League educated, he had served in a number of high positions. Polio, knocked him off of his feet, and he spent a number of years just trying to use his legs again. And in fact, during the reign of Roosevelt as president, his health is always going to be somewhat of an issue. So having overcome polio, Americans perceived Roosevelt as, a real fighter. He could fight on their behalf. And this was coming at a time, too, when people were questioning capitalism and democracy. Do these work? That's how bad the economic depression was, that perhaps we need to abandon capitalism, we need to abandon democracy. And in fact, in Europe, they were already doing so. What Roosevelt promised, though, was not to abandon capitalism, abandon democracy, but he promoted what was called the New Deal. And ultimately, it's going to be the New Deal that is Roosevelt's plan to fix the Great Depression, right? That's what the New Deal is. Roosevelt's plan to fix the Great Depression. When he was elected into office, he brought together a coalition of voters, sometimes called the Democratic Coalition, sometimes called the New Deal Coalition. And that was by creating a massive electoral bloc. Part of it was because of Hoover's unpopularity, right? Nobody wanted to vote for Hoover. But those voters stuck with the Democratic Party. That included African Americans, that included minorities, and organized labor, groups like the AFL. And this coalition of voters gave Roosevelt the victory in 1932 by a huge margin, right? Overwhelmingly, Roosevelt was chosen to be the next president. What followed was the Interregnum. The Interregnum is the period from the presidential election, which is November, to the time that the president takes office, which is typically, January or February, the time that they're sworn in. During the Interregnum, one thing that Roosevelt really made an effort to do was to not work with Hoover. Hoover was toxic, and there were many times where President Hoover approached Roosevelt, who was the next president-elect, and wanted to work something out in the meantime, Roosevelt waited until Hoover was out, until he finally came in, and then he would get his New Deal underway. So again, not work with the current sitting president during the interregnum, the period between the election and the inauguration. And the inauguration is when that president takes office. Roosevelt did talk about the plan, though, not in specifics, but in general terms. He said that he wanted the government to solve the problem, right? Much like the progressives before him. He wanted relief and work projects, unlike Hoover, to go to individuals, or at least a willingness to send it to individuals, where that's where Hoover was unwilling to do that. And regulation of, finance, of banks, and maybe most importantly, the stock market. These were all part of the plans. Most importantly, what Roosevelt had was pragmatism and open-mindedness, right? Open-mindedness, probably know what that means, kind of a willingness to try new things, to try new and different things. In fact, many of Roosevelt's New Deal programs end up being experiments. I mean, they've never really been done before. Pragmatism is, use it if it works. So the question is, does it work? Rather than sort of hold on to any sort of ideological position like Hoover did. Hoover held on to his ideology of individualness. Roosevelt's simply just going to see if it works. And if it works, do it. And if it doesn't work, then don't do it. And on his inauguration day, when he finally took office, it seemed like this was a new beginning. Roosevelt gave probably the most famous, or at least one of the most famous, inauguration day speeches, or at least lines, in which he said to the American public, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.